Gray light over a dead lumber mill in the hills of Maine. 40 years of saws gone silent under a padlock and a curling sheet of paper. Rain steaming off 20 tons of ruined steel that everyone in the county had already written off as junk. Then, out across the mud, a figure. A young woman moving slow between the leaning stacks, kneeling, measuring each rusted blade with a brass tool older than her mother. Her braid loose at the temple, her jaw set against something she has not said out loud. Boots on gravel from the office door. A man in polished leather and a gold watch chain, an account book pressed to his ribs. A smile already forming. He thinks he is about to rob a fool of $30. She has read something in that pile of rust that he cannot see, and she is not going to argue. She is going to let him laugh. Now let's step into the story. The rain had quit sometime before dawn, and the yard of the Ammon Falls Mill steamed under a gray Maine sky the color of dishwater. Adaline Hollis walked it slow, boots sinking into mud that had been packed gravel 2 winters back. She was counting, not walking. There is a difference, and anybody watching from the office window would have read it wrong. The closure notice hung stapled to the gate behind her, its bottom corner already curling in the damp. Ammon Falls Mill, Merrill County, 40-odd years of cutting white pine into dimensional lumber for half of eastern Maine, and the whole enterprise had ended with a sheet of paper and a padlock. She had her grandfather's brass-cased pocket caliper clipped to the front of her olive canvas jacket, and every dozen steps she pulled it, knelt, and set the jaws against the rim of a blade. She wrote the number in a pocket notebook with a stub of pencil, stood, moved on. Her braid had come loose at the temple and hung damp against the collar of her gray wool shirt, and a small coffee-colored birthmark below her left ear caught the wet light whenever she turned her head. 24 years old, 6 weeks an orphan of the only family she had left, and she was out in a dead lumber mill at first light measuring rust with a tool older than her mother. Ezra Hollis had died on the 14th of August, sitting on a stool in his own forge with a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He had left her 4 acres up Cobb Hollow, a house with a bad roof, a coal forge, a Peterite anvil worn bright at the horn, and 11 leather-bound journals with cord ties stacked in date order on a shelf that went back to the year he first struck iron for wages. She had read 4 of them in 6 weeks, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night to do it. On page 9 of the oldest volume, in that cramped, hard-pressed hand, he had written the one line she could not put down. Steel remembers every hand that ever worked it. No explanation around it. No paragraph to soften it. Just that. And then 3 pages on quench temperatures and the color of pine tar smoke. She had figured he meant it as a saying. It turned out he meant it flat and literal, and she was about to learn the difference the hard way. Here is what sat in the Ammon Falls yard while the town wrote it off. Blades. Circular saw blades stacked in leaning towers under a collapsed tin lean-to, some pushed down into the raspberry canes at the fence line and forgotten there since before she was born. Big ones, hedrig blades better than 4 feet across, thick as a man's thumb at the collar. Edgers, trim saws, gang blades, some with teeth still set in them, most with the teeth burned off or knocked loose. She counted them across 2 cold mornings and came out near 900. Added up honest, and it made something close to 20 tons of steel, the weight of a loaded freight car, lying in the mud and growing moss where the deer bedded down. Under the rust, on one headrig plate she had scrubbed with a wire brush and a rag soaked in kerosene, she found a stamp. Faint, worn nearly flat by 40 years of weather, but there. A maker's mark, and beneath it letters she had to tilt into the flat gray light to read it all. The name of a crucible works out of the Alleghenies, a small furnace that had melted tool steel in clay pots one batch at a time and then closed its doors before the war between the states was cold in the ground. Her grandfather had a page on that too. The old crucible men, he had written, he melted it slow in covered pots, and the slag carried off the dirt, and what poured out was the cleanest iron a body could hope to swing a hammer at. A blade like that is a bar of the finest tool stock ever made on this continent. Only somebody shaped it wrong. Somebody shaped it wrong. She stood there in the drizzle with the caliper in her fist and understood, in a way that made the back of her neck go cold, exactly what she was looking at. A saw plate is ground thin and hardened brittle to hold a tooth line at speed. Break the teeth and the plate is finished as a saw. Is not finished as steel. The carbon is still in there. All of it. And carbon is the whole argument. Then she went to the office. Harlan Price was somewhere in his middle 40s and soft through the middle. Sandy hair parted careful over a thinning crown. A gold watch chain looped across a vest that had never carried a day's sweat. He managed. He stood with his weight cocked on one hip, one hand tucked in a trouser pocket, chin lifted, and he held a leather-bound account book against his ribs, the way a man holds a thing he wants you to notice. His boots were polished to a shine that had never once touched the mud of the yard he ran. He looked at her boots first, then the braid, then the freckles and the worn jacket, and he priced her in about 2 seconds and came in low. "You're Ezra's granddaughter." "Yes. Sorry about the old man." He said it the way a man remarks that it looks like more rain now. The scrap spoken for, mostly, goes down to the foundry in Bangor whenever they send a wagon. But if there's something out there you've got a fancy for, I don't see the harm. I'd like to make an offer on the blades. That earned her a smile, the patient kind, the kind a man gives a dog that has done a small trick. An offer $30. All of them. There were 3 hands in the doorway behind her, coats buttoned, hands shoved deep, men who had lost their wages that same week and had nowhere in particular to stand. She did not turn around. Price looked past her to them first, because he wanted the audience, and then he laughed. Not a chuckle, a real one, head tipped back, the gold chain catching what little light came through the grimed window. $30 for 20 ton of ruined saw plate. He wiped the corner of one eye with a knuckle. "Miss Hollis, I have got a disposal problem sitting in that yard, and you are offering to pay me to make it disappear. Well, Lord, buy the whole pile." She stood square, shoulders level, hands loose at her sides. "I'll tell you what this is," he went on, tapping the account book against his knuckles. "This is the best piece of business I'll do all month. My tonnage drops, my close-out ledger comes out clean, and some slip of a girl from up the hollow carts off my rust so I don't have to hire a wagon to do it. Everybody comes out ahead." He leaned in a degree. "You do understand there's nothing in that pile. It's spent. Your grandfather spent 40 years banging on scrap in a shed and went in the ground with holes in his boots. Don't take it hard. Some families just don't have the nose for money." She did not answer him. That was the thing about her. And it is a thing worth learning early because it never once changed across everything that came after. She did not argue. Not with him, not with anyone. She let the insult sit in the air until it was his to carry and not hers. Price wrote out a bill of sale in the account book, pressed the pencil down hard, and signed it with a flourish that looped under his own name. He slid the page across the counter and kept 2 fingers on the corner just long enough to make her reach for it. "One more thing. The haul-off's on you. I can lend you a team and a wagon at $1 the day, or you find your own. And the yard's got to be clear inside a fortnight, because the new owner takes possession then. And I'll not be explaining your rust to him. 11 days. That is how long it took her. She found her own team rather than owe him the dollar, borrowing a pair of Belgians and a hay wagon off a widower, 2 farms down Cobb Hollow, who wanted 40 cents, and her word she would grease the axles and bring the animals back cooler than she took them. Then she made 24 trips through the mill gate with the bill of sale folded into her jacket, hauling plate and band stock and cracked gang blades, steel the mill had written off because sharpening cost more than melting. The loading was the worst of it. Nobody helped. The yard crew stood around a kettle drinking coffee out of tin cups and watched a woman of 24 wrestle 40-pound discs of hardened steel up a plank ramp by main strength, and one of them called out that there was a block and tackle in the shed if she wanted to learn the word please. She did not say please. She said nothing at all, and the freckles across the bridge of her nose stood out dark against skin, gone red at the cheekbones, and she kept lifting. Her braid came loose again by the 3rd load, and she retied it with steel dust still on her fingers and went back to the ramp. She wedged strips of old grain sack between the layers so the plates would not chew each other raw on the washboard, climb up the hollow road, and she chained the load flat, and she drove slow. By the 11th day, the pile in her yard stood higher than her waist and 18 feet across, right beside her grandfather's shop, and it made a sound. That is the thing nobody tells you about a mass of steel that size. It settles. It ticks and it groans as the day's sun heats it through and the night pulls the warmth back out. A slow metallic conversation the metal holds with itself. Adaline would lie in the narrow bed with the window cracked against the closeness of the room and listen to 900 pieces of dead saw blade talking in the dark, and she would think, that is mine now. All of it. Every ounce. The neighbors took to driving by slow. You know that particular pace, not stopped and not quite moving, the speed of people who want the look without owning up to taking it. Farm wagons easing past at a walk on a road where a body normally kept the horses trotting. Faces turned toward the yard, then the little cluck and slap of reins once they had cleared her mailbox, so the laughing could happen where she could not hear it. She heard it anyway. There is a kind of quiet that carries a laugh better than a shout ever could. A week into it, she walked the 3 miles down to Harrow's Ferry for supplies, and Dorcas Ainsley stood behind the counter of the mercantile, with her arms folded high across her chest and her feet planted wide. Gold wire spectacles slid down to the end of her nose, a stub of pencil parked behind one ear. She looked at the list Adaline set on the counter the way a bank looks at a note it does not mean to honor. Charcoal, a 20-pound sack of borax, 2 mill files. Dorcas read it aloud without touching it. You know what they're calling you up and down this road? Adaline set a coin on the counter. I expect I'll live. The rust heiress. The older woman said it flat. No cruelty in it exactly, which somehow made it worse than cruelty. Ezra Hollis was a good man and a fair hand at a shoe, God rest him. But that shop's been cold going on 6 weeks, and steel don't get younger sitting out under the weather. You bought yourself 900 pieces of ruin, honey. Somebody at that mill watched you coming a long way off. I'll need a receipt for the borax. That was the whole of it. That was her entire reply. She took the receipt and the charcoal and the files, and the little bell over the door made the only other sound in the store as she left. And Dorcas Ainsley watched her go with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. Here is what nobody in Harrow's Ferry understood, and it is worth setting down plain because the whole of what follows turns on it. Sat in her yard was not ruin. Industrial saw plate of that era was cut from high-carbon, crucible steel, tool stock a mill paid dear for, because it had to hold a working edge through a full shift of old-growth pine without going soft. The mill threw the plate out because a broken tooth line makes a saw useless, and a useless saw is a scrap ticket. That arithmetic is sound as far as it goes. It only fails to notice that the steel underneath the ruined teeth is precisely as good as the day it was poured. The carbon does not leak out through a chipped tooth. It stays. Ezra Hollis had known that. It was written down. It was all written down, and she had it stacked on her kitchen table under a cold mug of chicory coffee, and she meant to learn every word of it if it took her the winter. She read them at the table by lamplight. The oldest first, then the 6 that had lived in a tin box under the workbench, then the 4 newest. Every page in that same cramped square hand that pressed hard enough to raise the letters on the reverse of the sheet like a blind man's book. Critical temperature on the saw plate, he had written, judge by the color coming up and the dark shadow that crosses the face just before. Then a slow 10-count quench in tallow cut with linseed, warmed first with a hot bar, for cold oil cracks a thin blade the way a cold morning cracks a full water bucket. 2 temper cycles at the color of straw, an hour apiece, air cool between, and she comes out hard enough to shave with and tough enough she'll not chip on a hidden knot. She read it until she could recite it with her eyes shut. Then she had to learn everything he never wrote down because a dead man cannot answer a question, and she had a great many questions. The first was how to tell one steel from another when every last blade in the pile looked the same shade of rust. The grinding wheel taught her that. She would touch a blade light to the stone and watch the sparks come off it, and the sparks told the truth the rust concealed. Low steel threw long orange streamers that ran out straight and died. The good stuff broke. Each spark burst at its end into a little forked star, a bright bushy spray that kept splitting the harder the carbon ran, and the more it split, the more edge that blade would hold. She burned through a week of short winter afternoons at that wheel, sorting the pile into 3 heaps by nothing in the world but the shape of a spark. Bright and Forking went by the shop door for knives and chisels. Lazy and Orange got stacked out back for hinges, hooks, whatever forgave a softer temper, What she could not read at all she set aside to puzzle over later. The cutting of the blanks near broke her hands before the forging ever began. She had no torch and would not have known what to do with one, so she roughed her shapes with a hardy chisel, set in the anvil and a 4-pound hammer, then cleaned the lines with a hacksaw and a cold chisel, and hardened saw plate laughs at a hacksaw the way granite laughs at a spoon. She snapped 19 hacksaw blades cutting stock for the first 8 knives. The blisters came up across both palms inside 3 days, broke, filled, broke again, and by the second week, the skin beneath had gone to a yellow callus a match would strike on. She wrapped the worst of it in rag and kept cutting, because there was nobody to take a turn and the pile was not going to shrink out of pity. The first knife she carried all the way through was a 6-inch drop point cut from the edge of a trim saw. She heated it in the coal forge, watched the color climb through dull red to cherry to that pale rising orange, judged it the way the journal said, watched for the shadow to cross the steel, and dropped it into the tallow. The sound was wrong. A sharp crack, like a green stick snapping under a boot heel in cold weather. She fished it out, and the blade came up in 2 pieces, split lengthwise straight down the spine, a clean fracture running the full length of it where the steel had let go without warning. She sat down on the packed dirt of the shop floor in the near dark, forge banked low and orange behind her, one half of the ruined blade in each hand, and she stayed there a long while and did not weep, because weeping would not tell her anything she needed to know. Then she got up, found the stub pencil, and wrote it in her own book the way Ezra would have. First blade, cracked at the quench. My fault, cause unknown. Morning came gray and wet off the river, and she carried both halves of the dead knife into the kitchen and set them on the table like evidence laid before a judge. She untied the cord on the oldest journal and went hunting for a line she half remembered from a night 3 weeks gone. She found it 40 pages in that hard slanting pencil. Steel remembers everything you ever do to it. Heat it slow and cool it slower. The crack was in there long before the quench ever found it. You only gave it leave to open. She read it 3 times, and then she got up from the table and walked back out to the shop in the drizzle and looked hard at the stub of trim saw she had cut the billet from, and she saw it. Along the edge where her hardy chisel had bitten hot through the plate, there ran a thin band the color of an old bruise, a hard glassy line maybe 1/8 of an inch deep. Cutting the plate hot had heated a narrow strip to orange, and the great cold mass of the surrounding steel had drunk that heat away in a matter of seconds, quenching that one strip right there on the anvil, freezing a brittle skin the length of every cut she made. She had hammered and ground and shaped all the rest of the blade and never once touched that ruined margin, and when the warm tallow closed over the finished knife, the steel split along that hidden line like a board splits along a scored pencil mark. You cannot outmuscle a fault like that. She understood it standing there with the cold rain on her neck. You cannot hammer it flat, or grind it away, or will it gone. You have to unmake it clear back to the beginning and start over from nothing. The word in the journal for that was anneal. Bring the whole blade to critical heat. Hold it there. Then bury it in something that gives up its warmth over long hours instead of quick minutes so that every grain in the steel relaxes back to soft and even. Wood ash, dry lime, a bed of sand. Erase the brittle margin. Erase every hurt the cutting had done it and start from a blank slate, soft as it had been the day it poured from the crucible, which meant she needed an oven and not a forge fire. She needed a box that could hold an even heat all the way around a blade, and she did not have one, and she had no money to buy the makings of one. But she had seen the makings, and this is the part of it that has a bitter sort of humor. Behind the old drying kiln at the Ammon Falls yard sat a heap of broken fire brick, torn out of a boiler surround when they last relined it and never hauled off. On one of her final trips for the saw plate, she had asked Price about it, straight, no wheedling, and he had stood there in his shining boots, with the account book against his hip, chin tipped up like a man appraising a heifer, and he had made her a gift of it. Take whatever you've a mind to out of that heap, Miss Hollis. It's rubble. Same as everything else you've been carting off my property. He had smiled at his own generosity. Some people just have a gift for collecting up other men's failures. I expect it keeps you occupied. She loaded 81 whole bricks into the borrowed wagon and did not favor him with an answer. and she hauled his rubble up Cobb Hollow along with the last of his rust. It cost her 2 full days to build. She dug a shallow trench behind the shop and laid a floor course of the fire brick on a bed of river sand, raised the walls 2 courses thick, and roofed the whole of it with a sheet iron hood she cut and riveted herself, lined inside with more of the brick. One end she left open for the firebox. The other she fitted with a length of 6-inch stovepipe she bought off Dorcas Ainsley, who stood behind her counter with her arms crossed high and her spectacles down her nose, and rang up the pipe without asking a single question, which was, Adaline would understand only later, its own particular kind of vote cast quiet. The first fire smoked straight back out the firebox door and choked her clear out of the shop, eyes streaming, coughing into her sleeve. Too little draft. She let it die and cool, then did the thing Ezra had written down for testing a balky flue. She cut a strip of muslin the length of her hand, held it at the mouth of the firebox, and watched. The cloth hung dead straight down, not the least breath of pull to it. She raised the chimney 3 feet higher on a scavenged section of pipe, packed the joint with creek clay, and lit it again. This time the muslin snapped inward and stayed there, flat and trembling, pointing into the fire like a compass needle finding north. Air wants to go somewhere, Ezra had written in the margin beside a little sketch of a chimney. Give it a road or eat the smoke. There is no third way. She had no parameter and no coin to send away for one. So she read her heat by color the way the old men had always done it. Dull red at the low end, cherry climbing to bright cherry, orange coming on above that, and the surest test of all, the one Ezra swore by across 3 separate pages, was the shadow. He called it the coming dark, the way a faint gray cloud seems to cross the face of the glowing steel at the exact instant the grain rearranges itself inside. The moment the metal reaches the temperature where it forgets its old hard structure and takes up a new soft one. Watch for the shadow, he had written. When it passes and the color evens out behind it, you have found the door. She held a blade at bright cherry and watched, and there it came, a dim wave crossing the orange face and passing on, and behind it the glow came up smooth and even, and she knew she had found the door he meant. She annealed the first ruined billet, held it at heat a slow count of many minutes, then buried it in a bucket of dry hardwood ash and walked away from it for 14 hours. In the morning she took it out and set a file to it. The file bit. Smooth curls of soft gray steel peeled up under her hand where before the tool had only skated and screamed, and it cut soft and even all the way through the old brittle margin, the bruise line gone as though it had never been there at all. She had unmade the fault. She stood in the shop doorway, turning the softened billet over in the flat morning light, and understood that she had just learned the single most important thing her grandfather never got the chance to say aloud to her. From that soft stock, she cut a small draw knife, 9 inches of edge with the tangs bent to take 2 ash handles she would turn herself. She ground the bevel, then back to the fire, up to critical once more, watched for the coming dark to cross and pass, and lowered the blade into the tallow warmed to blood heat so the shock would not be so brutal on the thin steel. It went in edge first straight down and she counted 7 and drew it out smoking. Did not crack. She tapped it against the anvil horn and it rang a clean high note with no dead buzz of a hidden flaw anywhere in it, glass hard. And temper, which is the step every impatient soul skips and every impatient soul regrets, because hard steel with no temper in it is not a tool, it is a thing waiting to shatter in your hand. She polished the blade bright with emery, laid it flat on a bar of hot iron, and watched the temper colors crawl out along the steel from the thick spine toward the thin edge. Pale straw first, then a deeper straw, then bronze creeping up behind. When the straw reached the very edge, she killed it in a trough of cold water. Straw holds a keen edge. Bronze bends and forgives a hard knock. She had wanted straw at the cutting edge, with bronze standing behind it to catch the shock, and when she wiped the water off and looked, that was exactly what she had. The field test came 3 days on a felled white pine gone green and wet and full of pitch, the worst wood there is for an edge because the sap gums the fibers and drags. She sat astride the log with the draw knife and set to peeling. Long, pale ribbons curled up over her wrists and dropped away. An hour. 2. The freckles stood out red where the river wind found her face, the loose chestnut braid going damp at her spine, the sleeves of the olive jacket shoved back past her forearms. 4 hours in, she had never once stopped to touch a stone to the edge, and at the graying end of the afternoon she ran her thumb along it, and it still caught and lifted a curl of skin. She did not go down to town with it. She did not carry it to Dorcas Ainsley and lay it on the counter to be looked at. She walked back to the shop in the dusk, banked the forge up fresh, and laid out enough sorted stock for 6 more. 6 finished tools she carried down to the Saturday market at Harrow's Ferry the following week, laid out in a row on a square of grain sack across a folding table. 2 draw knives, a brush hook, a bark spud, a froe, a short chisel with a hickory handle she had shaped and burned her mark into. She priced them at $1.50 apiece, a little card standing in front, in her own block printing. Hollis tools, forged from mill steel, sharpened and proved. She sat behind that row the better part of 6 hours in the faded canvas jacket, the braid down her back, the brass caliper clipped to her pocket where it always rode, and she watched the town do the thing that takes the heart clean out of you. They picked the tools up. That is what gets you. They lifted them and felt the balance and ran a thumb down a spine and set them back on the sack and walked on toward the cider and the eggs. A man in a drover's hat turned the brush hook over twice and asked what she did for her living, and when she told him she made tools, he smiled the way a body smiles at a child selling switchel from a crate. "That's a fine little pastime," he told her, and drifted off toward the corn. A fine little pastime. 3 sales in 6 hours, and a stranger deciding her whole life was a way of passing the time. She did not say a word to him. She squared the grain sack, straightened the row of blades that remained, and sat out the last hour with her hands folded and her chin level, because a woman who lets her face fall in a public market has already sold something she meant to keep. 2 weeks along, a farmer named Alden Frey came back to her table. He had bought the brush hook that first Saturday, the one man all that day who had asked her nothing at all, only paid his $1.50 and carried it off. Now he stood before her with it, in his fist, the edge chewed but not rolled, the temper line still clean and even down its length. "Cut blackberry and alder along my whole ditch bank with this," he told her, turning it in the light so she could see. "Ditch a 1/4 mile if it's a foot, and I never once had to lay a stone to it." Then he bought 2 more, a draw knife and a froe, and paid without haggling, and touched his hat, and went. That is how a thing like this begins. Not with applause, not with a crowd. With one man with dirt worked into the creases of his hands, standing at a market table doing quiet arithmetic in his head about how long an edge lasts and what that is worth to a body who works for his bread. Because here is the arithmetic she had already run herself, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp low, the only proof she owned resting in her own 2 worked hands. She had paid $30 for near 20 tons of crucible steel, stock the mill would have paid a wagon to cart to the foundry. Each tool ate somewhere between a foot and 18 inches of usable plate. Call it 1.5 feet on the average. That was many thousands of tools sleeping in the heap beside her shop, and the raw steel in any one of them had cost her less than a cent. Charcoal, borax, handle stock, and her own labor at 4 honest hours a blade. $1.50 out, less than a penny of steel in. Every man who had laughed at her for buying that pile had the very same arithmetic sitting open in front of him. Not one of them had troubled to work the sum. They saw rubbish because a man in shining boots with an account book had told them it was rubbish, and it never crossed a single mind in Merrill County that the man with the account book had been measuring by the pound, while the granddaughter of a dead blacksmith had been measuring by the grain. Winter came in hard and wet the way it does on that stretch of Maine river country, the rain moving sideways for days at a stretch and the road up Cobb Hollow gone to a brown soup that sucked the boots off your feet. She moved a cot and a blanket out to the shop and near enough lived in it through December, close to the fire and the work. That is when the shop stove turned against her. Ezra's old barrel stove, a rig he had forged and riveted up himself out of sheet iron decades back, took to smoking back at her. Not a wisp. A whole gray gutful shoving out the loading door every time she cracked it, filling the shop wall to wall until she could not see the far bench and her eyes ran streaming down her face. She tried burning drier wood and got the same. She built the fire up bigger, thinking more heat would drag the smoke up and out, and got worse and then she stopped guessing at it and started measuring the way the whole hard autumn had taught her to. She tore a strip off an old flour sack and held it at the mouth of the stove. Should have leaned in and drawn toward the fire. It hung dead a moment, then drifted lazy out toward her face. No draft at all. The chimney was not pulling. She went up the ladder into the sleeting rain, and there it was, a full season's worth of black creosote glazing the flue, and the whole works choked half shut, and the cap itself set too low where her own hand had put it, right down in the dead eddy of wind that spilled off the shop's new roof line. The roof line she had patched over herself back in the dry of August. Her repair to the roof had broken his stove. She ran a length of chain down the flue and scraped it out, then lifted the cap a foot and a half on a section of scavenged pipe and held the muslin to the firebox once more. And it snapped inward hungry and held there flat. Failure teaches you the building. She knew that chimney's whole hidden anatomy now, every foot of it, and she would never have learned a line of it if the thing had only worked. Then came the night that always comes. Rain drumming steady on the roof, deep in February, and two papers side by side on the kitchen table under the lamp. One was a notice from the bank in Harrow's Ferry, plain as a slap, informing her that the mortgage her grandfather had carried on the 4 acres stood 2 payments behind, with a third coming due before the thaw. The other was a letter from a timber outfit up in Bangor, offering her $800 for the whole parcel, standing timber and buildings and all, a quick, clean sale with no inspection and the money in her hand inside a month. $800 is real money to a woman living on $1.50 Saturdays and a sack of dried beans. She sat with both hands flat on the table, the color high across her cheekbones from the cold of the room, the freckles standing out stark, and she thought about it. Not in a swoon of despair. Seriously, the plain hard way you think about a thing when you are tired enough all the way to the bone to actually do it. She got up and walked out into the rain and put her flat palm down on the cold face of Ezra's anvil. 280 pounds of a dead man's argument, the face polished to a black mirror by 60 years of somebody else's work, the horn worn down on the one side, because he had been right-handed and stubborn to the last. The journal lay on the bench where it lived, the cord tied loose. She opened it near the middle to a page she already knew the shape of before she found it. Waste is only a failure of imagination. That was the whole of the line, no flourish, his hands sloping small and sure. She stood in the dark shop with the rain going on the roof and read it twice over, and the $800 quietly stopped being money and turned back into what it truly was, which was a stranger's offer to buy her out of the only work that had ever once fit the shape of her 2 hands. She carried the letter to the stove the next gray morning and fed it in, and the draft she had fought so hard to earn took the flame clean and drew the smoke straight up and out, the way it was always meant to. By the first thaw, she stood at the market table with 12 tools laid out instead of 6, and she had begun to understand that what sat under the tin beside her shop was not a pile of failures at all. It was a question nobody in the county had thought to ask, and she was the only soul left alive who had been handed the book with the answer already written in it, in a cramped hard hand, by a man who had gone into the ground certain that the steel would remember every hand that ever worked it, and just as certain that his granddaughters would be the next. The differential temper was the next wall she walked into, and it very nearly took her hands off at the wrist before she learned to climb it. She had read the 4 pages Ezra gave the subject, and the idea sat simple enough on paper. A cutting tool wants 2 natures in the 1 bar of steel. It wants a hard edge that will take a razor grind and hold it through a day's work, and it wants a soft spine behind that edge, soft enough to bend under a blow instead of snapping clean the way glass-hard steel will do. Get both in a single blade, and you have made a thing that outlives the man who buys it. Miss it, and you have made a pretty knife that breaks the first time somebody drops it on a stone floor. The old way to get both was clay. You painted the spine in a thick slurry and left the cutting edge bare, and when the whole blade plunged into the quench, the naked edge shed its heat in an instant and froze hard, while the clay-jacketed spine gave its warmth up slow and stayed tough as a green branch. She dug her clay out of the creek bank behind the shop, the gray seam that ran under the shelf of a big root where the water had cut down to it, and she screened it through a scrap of window wire into a bucket, worked in wood ash off the forge floor and a little powdered charcoal until the stuff went on to steel like cake, frosting off a knife. She laid it a 16th thick along the spine of a paring blade, left the last quarter-inch of edge standing naked, and set the blade on a rack by the window to dry 2 full days. The first one worked. She quenched it in the warm tallow, ground the flat back bright the next morning, and there it stood, a wavering gray line running the whole length of the blade where hard met soft, like the mark of tide leaves drying on sand. She carried it to the shop door and held it up to the flat light a long moment, and did not smile exactly, but something eased in her chest that had been drawn tight since the first knife cracked in the oil. The second batch nearly broke her for good. 8 kitchen blades, 10 inches on the edge, ground thin as a coin where the steel met air. She quenched them the way she had quenched everything to that hour, laying each one down into the tallow at a slant, edge leading and the flat of the blade coming in behind at an angle. Every last one came up out of the trough curved, like a reaping hook. 6 she could straighten while they still held warmth, working them careful over the anvil horn before the temper set. 2 let go with a small clear sound, like a struck water glass, and she stood there in the lamplight with a broken knife in each hand, and a whole week of cutting and grinding and shaping ruined inside 4 seconds of quench. She sat up past midnight over it, the tallow still smoking in the trough, and she worked it, the way her grandfather worked everything, by taking the failure apart until it confessed. A thin blade going into oil edgewise cools along one face before the other. One side draws up tight, while the far side has not yet begun to move, and the steel bows toward the cold, because iron does not care in the least about a woman's week of labor or her rent coming due. So she changed the one thing she could change. She would enter the blade edge down, dead plumb, straight into the oil in a single motion, so the thinnest steel struck the tallow first, and the 2 flat faces cooled at the same instant, left and right together, with nothing to pull the blade one way over the other. She built a little wooden guide off the rim of the trough to hold her wrist true through the plunge, because a hand shakes at midnight no matter how steady its owner means to be. The next 8 came out of the oil straight as a rule, every one, and she understood that the whole difference between a ruined week and a good one had been the angle of a wrist, and that nobody had ever thought to write that particular truth down, because nobody had ever been poor enough to need it as badly as she did. That was the shape of the whole business, if a body stood back far enough to see it. A small correct thing learned alone in the cold, at an hour when sensible people slept, standing between her and a pile of broken steel worth nothing to anyone. Every maker for 50 miles was buying soft imported bar stock at the mercantile and cursing how quick it went dull, and not one of them had sat up with a smoking oil trough long enough to learn what a dead blacksmith had already set down in pencil. The measuring was making her, blade by straightened blade, into something the county did not yet have a word for. She built the ledger next, because a mark meant nothing without a memory standing behind it. Every bar of that mill steel got a number of its own. She had pulled better than 600 usable bars out of the sorted heaps, and she logged each one into a school composition book bought off Dorcas Ainsley's shelf for a nickel. Bar number, weight on the grain scale, the spark color she had read off it at the wheel, which of the 3 heaps it had come out of, and then, once she cut a bar into blanks, which finished blades were born from it. Blade 38 came from bar 12. Blade 210 came from bar 71. If a knife ever came back to her, cracked or gone soft in a customer's hand, she would know the bar it was cut from, and she would know every other blade cut from that same bar, and she could pull them all before they failed in somebody's field. Provenance is an ugly word for a plain idea. Know where the metal came from, and you can prove to any man alive what it is. Then she took her grandfather's stamp out of the bottom drawer of the bench, where it had lain under a rag the whole 6 weeks since his death. A hand-cut steel punch, the face of it worn smooth at the corners, a capital H standing inside a circle a quarter-inch across. He had driven that mark into every hoof knife and draw knife and froe he had ever sold across 60 years. And after they buried him, the die had sat in the dark under that rag while she learned whether she had any right to it. She set the first knife of the true season on the anvil, still black with forge scale, and drove the punch home with one square blow. The H bit clean and deep. She turned the blade over in her hand and understood a thing most makers take 10 years to feel in the gut. A maker's mark is not decoration. It is a promise you cannot take back once it is struck, and it will follow the steel long after your own hand is dust. Word of Alden Frey's ditchbank had gone up and down the hollow roads, the slow way such things travel, one man leaning on another's fence rail of an evening. A dairyman came up Cobb Hollow in March with a hay knife whose edge had rolled over on the second cut, bought at the mercantile the autumn before, and asked her plain, no smirk anywhere on him, whether she could make him one that would hold. She could. He watched her cut the blank and asked what the little H in the circle meant, and she told him it meant she would stand behind it. And he paid without a word about the price, which was double what the store had charged him for the one that failed. Dorcas Ainsley never made an announcement of her change of heart. That was not her way, and it would not have been believed if she had. She simply drove her buggy up the hollow one raw Saturday morning, planted her feet wide in the yard the way she planted them behind her counter, arms crossed high, and bought 3 tools for hard cash: a draw knife, a paring knife, a hoof pick. The following Monday, all 3 sat on the counter at the mercantile beside the till, laid out on a square of oiled leather with a card standing behind them in her own upright hand. Made local. Ezra Hollis's granddaughter. The stub pencil went back behind the woman's ear as though nothing at all had passed between them, and neither of them ever spoke of the afternoon she had named the girl a rust heiress to her face. The 3 tools sold inside 9 days. Dorcas sent word up the hollow by the milk wagon that she wanted 6 more, and a shoebox appeared behind her counter for the letters that had begun to come. You could feel the town shift its weight that spring, not into praise. Harrow's Ferry was not a place that praised, and would have distrusted a man who tried it. The laughing simply stopped. Men who had made sport of the girl playing at the anvil in her grandfather's cold shop went quiet when her name came up at the feed store, which in that county was nearer a standing ovation than anything a body ever heard out loud. But respect and belief are 2 different animals, and she was about to learn how far apart they stand, because feeling in her own 2 hands that the steel was extraordinary was one thing, and proving it to a stranger who held her future in his ledger was another thing entirely, and she had no proof at all beyond her own worked palms and a growing stack of numbers in a nickel notebook. A woman who can only say it feels different gets shown the door. A woman who can lay a piece of paper on the counter does not have to say anything. So she did the thing that cost $4 and changed the shape of everything that followed. She cut a coupon off the tang end of a spare blade, an inch by 2, ground clean and bright on both faces, wrapped it in a scrap of oiled rag, and carried it down to the post office at Harrow's Ferry with a money order and a letter. The letter went to an assay and testing house in Portland, run by a man named Thaddeus Colby, whose advertisement she had found in the back leaves of a farm journal at the Mercantile, offering full analysis of ores, alloys, and metals by wet chemistry and fire, results returned by post. $4 was 2 weeks of groceries. She ate beans and cornbread and creek water and waited 19 days for the mail wagon. She knew the steel was strange. She had known it in her hands for near a year, watching the color climb slower than any handbook described, learning that these old blades wanted a gentler quench than modern stock could stomach, that they held an edge past all reason, and rang a cleaner note off the anvil than anything the mercantile sold. What she did not know was why, and the why was the whole of it. Because a woman with a hard feeling in her gut gets laughed out of the room, and a woman with a chemist's letter in her hand runs the room without raising her voice. The report came back in a plain envelope heavier than a letter has any business being, and she opened it standing at her own mailbox with the wind pulling loose strands out of her braid. Colby's hand was small and precise, a scientist hand. Carbon 1/1500th of 1%. She read the figure 3 times before it settled. Not the 8 or 9/10ths of a common tool steel. Not the middling stuff a decent chisel is cut from. 1.15. High enough to take an edge like a straight razor and hold it through a season. High enough to become a nightmare in a careless hand, to crack and warp and split, which explained every ruined blade of her long apprenticeship. Then the trace column below it. Tungsten present. Vanadium a trace. Manganese low, and the sulfur and phosphorus so far down the scale that Colby had penciled a note of his own in the margin beside them. Unusually clean, he had written. Consistent with crucible melting, and beneath that a second note because the man had grown curious on his own time and gone digging through an old alloy reference on his shelf. This composition matches a tool stock produced in small crucible lots by an Allegheny furnace that ceased operation before the war. There is not a mill on this continent pouring steel of this cleanliness today, not for want of the skill, for want of a buyer willing to pay 4 times the going price for iron this honest. She sat down on the wet floor of the shop with the report on her knees and stayed there a long while, not reading it again, just holding it. Then she got up and walked out under the lean-to and counted the pile once more, slow the way she had counted it that first gray morning at the mill. Near 900 blades, some cracked, some pitted deep. The great headrig plates running better than 4 feet across and heavier than a full-grown man, the trim saws half that. And every one of them, she had measured it herself with the brass caliper that had ridden her pocket through every cold hour of the winter, would yield somewhere between 20 and 30 good blanks, depending on how cleverly she nested her cuts around the old teeth and the hidden cracks. She did the arithmetic on the back of Colby's letter with the stub pencil. It ran to many thousands of tools, chisels and draw knives and plain irons, and paring knives out of steel that no living furnace poured and no amount of money could order fresh at any price on earth. Harlan Price had stood on that gravel in his shining boots with the account book against his hip and told her the pile was spent scrap fit only for the foundry wagon. He had been standing on top of a small fortune, explaining to its rightful owner that she was too simple to know she held one. She folded the letter along its creases, and she did not feel triumph. She felt something colder and steadier and far more useful than triumph, which was certainty. And certainty is the one thing a man like Price can never take back once you have it in writing. Word went out the way word goes out in small worlds, which is to say slowly, along kinship lines and feed store benches, and then all at once. Josiah Wren was the name that lit the fuse, though she did not know it when his first letter came. Wren ran a small mail-order house out of Boston that sold hunting and camp goods by catalog to sporting men across New England, and he had handled one of her skinning knives at a friend's table in Portland, taken it home, spent an evening over an oilstone with it, and come away shaken. His letter said he had put an edge on a great many knives across 19 years in the trade and had never in his life felt steel take a stone the way hers did. He used the word held 3 separate times in the one page. He wanted 12 knives, not 12 of anything she pleased. 12 cut from her lowest numbered stock, blade number 400 or under, and he named the figure without her having quoted one. $13.20 for a dozen blades born from a heap the mill had wanted to charge her a wagon fee to cart away. She read the letter twice, walked back to the shop, and pinned it to the plank wall beside the one photograph she owned of her grandfather, a stooped man in a chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, one hand set flat on the bench edge, as though the bench needed his weight to hold it to the floor. Then she filled the order slow and would not be hurried, because the numbers Wren wanted mattered more than he could know. Blade 400 and under came from the first bars she had ever sorted, and she had logged every one. And she could put a knife in his hand and tell him the bar it was cut from and the day she forged it, which no maker in New England was troubling to do. Wren wrote about the 12 knives in a collector's newsletter that went to perhaps 900 sporting men scattered across 6 states, and by June the letters came from Vermont and New Hampshire, from a man in the Berkshires who restored antique fowling pieces, from a boatwright on the Kennebec who wanted slicks that would hold an edge through the white oak of a ship's frame. Dorcas Ainsley's shoebox overflowed, and she went to a second box, ringing up the overflow mail behind her counter and telling anyone who asked that no, she was not taking orders, she was only holding the box, which fooled nobody, since a woman who holds the box has already picked her side. Adaline raised her prices, then cut her output from 9 knives in a week down to 5. People up and down the hollow told her that was backward, that a body raised prices only when she could not meet the demand and lowered output only when nobody wanted the goods. And here she was doing both at once and turning custom away besides. She did not argue the point. She simply stopped selling anything she would have been ashamed to lay in her grandfather's hand across a workbench. And she began laying brick for a second annealing oven, because near 20 tons of steel is a very long conversation, and one firebox was never going to see the end of it. The Berkshires man came in person that summer, a careful, thin gentleman who arrived on the noon coach and walked the last 3 miles up the hollow rather than hire a rig. He wanted to watch her work before he ordered, and she let him, which she did not do for most. He stood at the shop door out of the way and watched her forge weld a mattock head across the better part of 2 days, watched her judge the coming dark shadow on the hot steel, watched her check a taper with the brass caliper and shave a curl of hair off her own forearm to prove an edge. On the second evening he asked quiet where the steel had come from, because he had been in and around fine tools his whole life, and this was not modern stock. This looked like something older and cleaner than the trade had made in decades. She reached over and turned the blade in his hand so the low sun caught the tang, and she read him the numbers stamped there. Blade 317, bar 88, Ammon Falls Mill, loft stock. And she told him the year the Crucible Works had poured it, the way Colby's report had let her tell it. And the man went very still and did not ask the price after that, because the price had stopped being the question. Then the harder season came, the one nobody warns you about. The season where a thing you have built begins to want more of you than you have to give. The waiting list, which she had at first called a list, and then began to call a book, because that is honestly what it grew into, ran past a year. She turned a Boston hardware jobber away flat when he offered to take her entire year's output at a wholesale figure that would have cleared the banknote in a single stroke and left money over for a proper roof on the house. He stood in her yard in a checked suit and could not fathom the refusal, and asked her, half laughing, whether she understood how commerce was conducted. She looked at him with those pale gray-blue eyes gone level and cold, and told him that she understood it precisely, which was why the answer was no, and that a man who bought her whole year would sell it in 1 week to whoever paid most, and the steel would scatter to men who did not know what they held, and she would spend the rest of her life not knowing where any of it had gone. That was not the work. The jobber went back down the hollow, calling her a fool to anyone who would listen. And inside a month 3 of the men he told the story to had written her asking for knives of their own. Scarcity was the whole of the business, though she never once said the word aloud to a living soul. She had a finite heap of crucible steel out of a furnace that no longer existed, poured by men who had died before her mother drew breath, and every knife she sold made the one still under the tin worth a little more than the day before. It was the slow, careful bleeding of a thing that could never be replaced, the exact opposite of everything the county had ever done with anything it got its hands on, and it ran clean against the grain of a nation that measured a man by how fast he could turn a resource into cash. She was turning cash into time, and time into scarcity, scarcity into a name. A name would outlast her. She lost 11 blades that first full year to rust, and the loss taught her the shed. She found them one autumn morning furred over with red scale in a low corner of the pile where the airflow died against the wall, the pits gone deep enough that they would follow the steel through the fire and rise up as ugly craters in a finished spine. She could not save them for anything better than hooks. That same afternoon she cut a vent in the wall to move the dead air, and she began to plan a proper house for the rest of it, because leaving a fortune to sit under a leaning tin roof through Maine winters was a fool's economy, and she had run out of patience for fools, herself first among them. She built the shed with her own hands across the back half of the summer, 12 feet by 6, hand-framed of hollow pine, and she split cedar shakes off a windfall log for the roof and nailed them on in overlapping courses, because cedar breathes where sheet metal sweats, and rust is only water plus time, and she meant to deny it both. She left a 4-inch gap running the length of the eaves on both long walls, so the air moved through the building all day without ever letting the rain in. She set the coils and the heavier plates on locust skids 6 inches clear of a gravel floor, and twice a year, at the spring thaw and again before the first hard freeze, she went through every bar with a rag and a mix of boiled linseed cut with spirits, wiping each one down until the steel came up dull silver in her hand instead of powder orange. The system came out of the failure stronger than it had gone in, the way everything she built did, because she had learned to treat a loss as a letter the work had written her, and to read it before she cursed it. The apprentice came in October, near the end of that second full year, and her arrival was its own small reversal in a life that had grown used to standing alone at the anvil. A young woman of 22 named Winnie Calder walked up Cobb Hollow with a canvas duffel over one shoulder and a letter in her coat she had, by her own admission, written out 3 times before she trusted it to the post. She had come inland from the coast, from a fishing family that could not understand why a girl would want soot under her nails, and she asked, before she had even set the duffel down, when she would get to forge. Adaline handed her a ruined blade instead, 6 inches of pitted stock off the rust-eaten 11, and a mill-bastard file. Flat, she told her. Both faces. Come find me when your arms give out. Then softer, because she remembered standing exactly that raw and that hungry, she gave the girl the line her grandfather had given her across a workbench a lifetime before. The line she had said to herself the night she nearly burned her future for $800. Waste is only a failure of imagination. That is not a saying I keep on a card. That is the file in your hand right now, and the ruin you are about to make good. Winnie filed for 6 hours and came away with a surface you could lay a straight edge across and see no light beneath. Her palms blistered the way Adaline's had blistered 2 winters gone, her jaw set against complaint. That night Adaline let her charge the annealing box herself, bury the filed blade in its bed of hardwood ash, bank the coals low, and set the whole slow business to cool through the dark and come out soft by morning. They pulled the shop door shut on it and let it run. 2 women in a cold Maine hollow with a bed of embers doing patient work behind a wall, and for the first time since the 14th of August, Adaline was not the only living hand in the county that knew what the steel remembered. Winnie learned faster than Adaline had expected, and faster than she let the girl see, because a young hand that hears too soon how good it is grows careless. By the turn of the year, she had her at the second bench, truing tangs and roughing bevels, and the work that had taken one pair of hands from dark to dark now moved through two, which meant the waiting book grew shorter for exactly 1 month, before word of a second maker under the Hollis roof brought a fresh wave of letters that swallowed the gain whole. There is no getting ahead of a good name once it starts to run. You can only decide who you will be while it runs. The first hard test of the new year did not come from a customer. It came up the hollow road on a fine sorrel horse, in a checked traveling coat, wearing the easy smile of a man who has never once in his life been told no and meant it. He introduced himself as an agent for a cutlery concern out of Connecticut, one of the big works that stamped out kitchen and pocket knives by the gross, and he had come, he said, because his principals had read Josiah Wren's little notice and grown curious about the Maine steel everyone in the sporting papers was suddenly writing home about. He walked her shed, with his hands clasped behind his back like a man touring a property he already owned. He lifted a head-rig plate, judged its weight, set it down. He asked, in the tone of a favor being extended, whether she had ever considered what her operation might become with proper capital behind it. A real forge, a dozen trained hands, a rolling mill to size the stock, a catalog reaching every hardware store from Portland to St. Louis. His concern would buy the entire heap outright, every bar under the cedar, at a figure that made the timber outfit's $800 look like pocket change, and they would put the Hollis mark on a line of factory blades and make her name known in every kitchen in the Republic. She let him finish, because a man like that has to be allowed to reach the bottom of his own well before he understands it is dry. Then she asked him one question. When your rolling mill has run the last of that steel through it, and the heap under my shed is gone, what does your factory make the year after? His smile did not falter, but something behind it recalculated. Why, we'd source new stock. There's steel enough in the world. Not this steel. She said it without heat, the way she stated the weather. There is not another pound of it on this continent, and the men who knew how to pour it are all in the ground. You would sell every bar of it inside 3 years, cheap, to people who would never know what they held, and then you would put my grandfather's mark on ordinary factory stock and sell that on the strength of the name until the name meant nothing. You are not offering to build me a business. You are offering to spend one, fast, and hand me the ashes. The agent left without buying so much as a paring knife, and he did not touch his hat on the way out, which told her she had read him true. She watched the sorrel pick its way back down the muddy hollow and felt no triumph in it, only the particular tiredness that comes of defending a thing from people who believe they are doing you a kindness. The world was full of men who would help her straight into ruin and call it progress, and every one of them would go away insulted when she declined to be improved. Word of the refused offer traveled the way everything traveled in that country, and it did something to her standing that no knife had managed on its own. Blacksmith of the old school named Amos Deering, who had shod horses in Harrow's Ferry for 30 years and had said, early on, that a woman at a forge was a novelty that would burn itself out by Christmas, drove up the hollow one Sunday with a cracked anvil in the bed of his wagon and asked whether she knew a way to face it back to true. She did. She spent an afternoon showing him the hard-facing trick out of Ezra's fourth journal, laying a new working surface over the worn one, and Deering watched her hands the whole time and said little, and when he left, he shook her hand at the gate, which for a man of his make was a longer speech than an hour of talk. That was the summer a fever moved through the low farms along the river, the kind that travels house to house in country, with one doctor and 40 miles of bad road between the far places and his door. It touched the Frey place, and Alden Frey rode up the hollow one evening gray in the face, not for a knife, but because his youngest had taken sick, and the doctor was 2 days off tending a farm on the far side of the ridge. Adaline had no medicine and no training, but in the oldest journal, in among the quench temperatures and the notes on pine tar, her grandfather had copied out in his hard hand a country remedy for fever he had gotten from his own mother, a poultice and a broth, and a way of keeping a small body comfortable and cool without a chill. She rode back down with Frey in the last of the light and stayed the night at the farm. She was no doctor and made no pretense of being one. But she was steady, and she did not frighten, and she followed the written wisdom of a woman 2 generations dead as carefully as she followed a quench temperature. By the next afternoon, the fever had broken clean, and when the doctor reached the Frey place at last, he found the child sitting up under a clean quilt, cool and hungry, and crossed the way a mending child is cross, asking after bread and butter. The doctor asked Frey, who had nursed the fever down, and Frey told him it was the Hollis girl. Working off a dead blacksmith's notebook, the doctor, a practical man with more work than hours, rode up the hollow himself the following week to copy the old remedy into his own book. That recovery did more for her name than the whole Connecticut refusal, because a knife is a thing a man buys, but a household kept whole is a thing a man remembers. And by the end of that summer, there was not a house on the river road that would hear a word against her. Dorcas Ainsley put it plainest, ringing up a customer at the Mercantile who had made some remark about the queerness of a girl living alone up a hollow with a forge. That girl sat up a whole night with Alden Frey's little one. When the doctor couldn't come, Dorcas told him over the top of her spectacles, the stub pencil coming out from behind her ear the way it did when she meant to be heard. You go on and tell me again what's queer about her. I've time. She raised her prices again that autumn, and this time nobody up the hollow called it backward, because they had begun to understand what she had understood for 2 years, that she was not selling knives so much as selling the last of something that could not be made again, and that every bar she let go was a bar the world would never see the like of. Collector came to the county fair in September, a thin, careful man in from Boston with a jeweler's loop in his vest pocket, and he moved down her table of 40 blades laid out on canvas the way a man moves through a gallery, touching nothing at first, only looking. He stopped at a skinner, lifted it at last, turned it to the light, and found the wavering temper line running its length. Then he found the small H inside its circle stamped in the tang, and his careful composure cracked for the first time. This grind, he began, and stopped, and started over. This is not modern practice. Nobody differential hardens a working blade anymore. It costs too dear in labor. And this steel, he tilted it, watching the light run along the temper line. Where did this come from? Because this is not any stock I can buy. She reached across and turned the blade in his hand and read him the numbers off the tang without hesitation. Blade 406. Bar 102. Ammon Falls Mill, loft stock. The collector did not ask the price. He asked whether she kept records of which bar produced which blade, and when she told him she kept a ledger going back to the first bar she ever sorted, that she could name the parent of any knife she had ever made, he set the skinner down very carefully, as a man sets down something he has just understood is worth more than he can presently afford, and he asked whether he might see the ledger. She let him look at the first volume. He turned the pages slow, reading the numbers and the dates and the spark colors in her plain hand, and when he closed it, he told her, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent a life around fine things, that she had built the one thing every collector in the country was starving for and could never find, which was proof. Anyone could claim old steel. She could document it. That was the word that changed the shape of the demand. Not sharp, not tough, documented. The collector wrote of her ledger in a periodical read by men who bought and sold fine tools the way other men bought and sold horses, and he printed the substance of what Colby's report had found, the carbon figure and the crucible cleanliness and the furnace that had closed before the war. He printed her rules verbatim, the ones she said aloud to buyers who came up the hollow, and that was the part that truly lit the fuse. Cash. One tool to a customer. She wrote a receipt and the buyer signed it. And if she learned a buyer had turned around and sold his knife to a dealer inside of a week, that buyer never bought from her again. People wanted the thing they were forbidden to buy in quantity. The rules that were meant to keep her steel in the hands of men who would use it turned it overnight into the most coveted thing 3 states could not get, and her waiting book, which had run past a year and past 3 inside a single season. The first wagons with out-of-county markings appeared on the hollow road before sunrise, teams standing in the dark with their breath steaming, men and women waiting on the seat with a lap robe and a covered tin pail of coffee for a light to show in the shop window. She did not advertise. She never bought a line of print in her life. Word moved the old way. One man telling another across a feed store counter, that man telling his brother down in New Hampshire, until the road that had once seen 4 wagons in a week saw 15 in a morning. Adaline came out at 6:15 with her braids still damp from washing, the olive jacket buttoned to the throat against the river cold, the brass caliper riding her pocket where it had ridden for 3 years. She did not wave. She did not make a speech. She unlatched the gate, hooked it back against its post, and walked to the bench she had set under the shed overhang with a coffee tin of pencils and a receipt book. By 7, there were 19 people in the yard. 2 of them were dealers up from Portland, and you could tell by the way their eyes went to the racks instead of the tools, counting inventory, working a markup in their heads. One was a writer down from a periodical in Augusta with a leather case of paper and a folding stool. Another was a writer she did not know was a writer at all until later, a man who had driven half the night from Concord and gone very quiet. When he saw the first fellow already in the line, the 2 of them circling each other's presence like dogs that have caught the same scent. She said her terms once at the front of the line in a voice that carried perhaps 40 feet and no farther. Cash. One tool to a person. A signed receipt, and no reselling to a dealer inside a week, or the door was shut to them for good. That was the whole of it, and one of the Portland dealers laughed and asked how exactly she meant to enforce a rule like that, whether she understood how a market truly worked, whether a girl in a hollow honestly imagined she could dictate terms to the men who moved the goods. She looked at him with those pale eyes gone flat and level in the cold, the color high on her cheekbones, and she said nothing at all to him. Then she called the next person forward. A farmer stepped up and bought a single draw knife and signed the receipt in a careful hand and touched his hat and went, and did not come back to trouble her, and the dealer who had laughed got no knife that morning or any morning after because she had marked his face, and she did not forget a face that had laughed at her, which the whole county could have told him for free. The receipt book was not sentiment, though the dealers took it for a woman's fussiness. It was a ledger of custody. Every tool she sold out of Ammon Falls steel carried its stamped number, and that number went into the book beside a name and a date and a place, so that 10 years on a collector could open the record and know exactly where a blade had traveled since the hour it left her fire. Nobody in New England was doing that. Nobody had thought the provenance of a working tool worth the ink until she made it the whole of the value, and then every maker for 500 miles wished he had thought of it first. The writer from Concord stayed 3 days. He slept in his wagon the first night, and Dorcas Ainsley, who had somewhere along the way decided that this was her business too, and whose decisions arrived without discussion, put him up on a cot in the mercantile storeroom the other 2 nights. He watched Adaline forge weld a slick over the better part of 2 days, watched her quench in the warm tallow, and read the temper colors crawling up the polished steel, watched her check a taper with the brass caliper and shave hair off her forearm to prove an edge. His piece ran in a national periodical that winter, 4 pages with 2 wood engravings, and the headline called her work the last of the Ammon Falls steel. He printed Colby's carbon figure. He printed the name of the vanished furnace. And he printed her rules word for word, all of them. And that was the thing that turned a busy shop into a siege. Her order book went from 3 years out to better than 5 in the space of a single issue, and the men who had stood in the mercantile in the first winter sang out loud that Ezra Hollis's granddaughter was hauling home a dead man's rust because she was too proud and too broke to buy a proper tool. Those men began to come. Not all at once, which would have been easier to bear. They came one at a time on weekday mornings when the road was empty, and no neighbor would witness it, hats literally in their hands. They did not say they were sorry, because no man in those hills had spoken that word aloud in the memory of anyone living. What they said was that they needed a brush hook, or that the mattock she had made for Delbert Coombs had not chipped once in 2 seasons in the ledge ground, and might she have the time to make its twin. She wrote them receipts. The same prices everyone paid, the same one-tool rule, no smirk, no speech, no reckoning called in. She had learned the one thing about being proven right that most people never learn, which is that the proving is worth nothing if you spend it on revenge, because a grudge collected is a fire that warms you once and leaves you colder than before. She let them buy their knives and sign their names, and she let the past lie where it had fallen, and that restraint did more to seal her name in that county than any blade ever forged. Dorcas Ainsley became the official dealer for the line that spring, and the whole negotiation took under 2 minutes at the mercantile counter. She stood with her arms crossed high, feet planted the way they were always planted, gold wire spectacles catching the window light, and said she would carry the tools, hold the terms exactly as written, and keep the custody numbers in a second book of her own. Adaline put out her hand across the counter. Dorcas took it. Neither of them made the smallest reference to the winter the older woman had named her the rust heiress to her face, because the handshake was the apology, and both of them knew it, and to have spoken it aloud would have cheapened a thing that was better left standing plain. Then Winnie's family trouble came up the hollow, and it tested something in Adaline that Steele never had. A letter arrived from the coast, from Winnie's mother, who had taken ill and needed the girl home to keep the household while the family found its feet. Winnie brought the letter to the bench with her hands not quite steady and asked, in a voice that fought to stay level, whether she could go for the winter and come back at the thaw, or whether leaving meant she had thrown away the one chance she had ever wanted. She had seen too many doors close behind her to trust that this one would stay open. Adaline took the girl's blistered hands in her own scarred ones and turned them palm up, looking at the calluses 2 years of filing had built there. You have a mother who needs you and a craft that will keep. Only one of those things is in danger of disappearing, and it is not the craft. Pressed a folded banknote into the girl's palm for the coach fare and closed her fingers over it. Go home. Nurse her well. The forge will be cold when you leave it and warm when you come back, because I will keep it that way, because that is what a person does for her own. You are not choosing between me and your mother. You are choosing your mother, which is the only right answer, and I will think less of you if you hesitate over it. Winnie went, and she came back at the thaw as promised. Her mother recovered, and her place at the second bench exactly as she had left it, and the loyalty that grew out of that winter was worth more to the shop than any amount of extra output the girl's absence had cost. A hand you have to buy will leave you the day someone bids higher. A hand you have stood by will stay through fire. The steel itself began to run low in the good grades before Adaline had expected, which was its own kind of reckoning, because she had known from the first day that the pile was finite and had built her whole business on the fact, but knowing a thing and watching the high carbon heaps actually thin under the cedar were 2 different weights to carry. She had used, by the careful count in her ledger, a little over 200 of the 900 blades in 3 years, which sounded slow to anyone doing the arithmetic, and it was slow, and it was slow on purpose. Every plate that came off the stack had a line in the book, the date she pulled it, its bar number, what she made from it, what it sold for, how it behaved under the hammer. Blade 187, hardened, run too brittle at the tip. Cracked at the water quench, he forged into two paring knives. Blade 203, clean and straight, took a keen edge without complaint. Nobody made her keep that record. Her grandfather's voice made her keep it. The voice of a man who had written down the moisture in a stick of oak in 3-inch pencil scroll and did not raise a granddaughter who would guess where she could measure. She began, that fourth year, to hold back the very best of the high-carbon stock, the cleanest bars with the brightest fork in the spark, setting aside a small reserve she told no one about, a locked chest in the house holding 24 finished blades of the finest steel she had, unnumbered in the public book, put by against a future she could not yet see the shape of but knew was coming, because a resource that cannot be replaced must have a portion of it protected from the very demand that proves its worth. She would need those blades one day, though she did not know for what, and the not knowing did not stop her setting them by, because some decisions a person makes on faith in itself she has not met yet. The creek tested her that same wet spring. It rose in the night to within a foot of the shed sill and stood the lower skids in a spreading pool that would have rusted every bar it touched inside a week. She did not wait for the water to decide her business for her. She spent that whole gray day, the rain still coming, moving better than a ton of steel by hand up the slope to the dry ground beside the house, one plate at a time up a plank made slick as ice by the wet, her boots sliding out from under her twice, the braid plastered to her neck, her forearms burning past the point where burning means anything. Winnie worked the other end of the plank without being asked. The two of them cleared the shed to the last bar, by dark, soaked through and shaking with the cold and the effort, and not one blade took the water. That night, warming by the house stove, Winnie asked her why she had not simply let the lowest few bars go, the pitted ones fit only for hooks, and saved herself the worst of the labor and the risk of the slick plank. Adaline looked at the girl over the rim of a tin cup and gave her the truth of it. Because the day you start deciding which of your responsibilities are worth the trouble is the day you stop being able to trust your own hands. I did not haul that steel up a mountain and learn it grain by grain to let a wet spring teach me carelessness. You save all of it, or you have already begun to lose all of it. She cut a proper diversion channel above the shed that summer and raised the sill a full foot on new stone. The creek never threatened the steel again, because she had read the flood the way she read every failure. As a warning issued once, she had answered it before it needed issuing twice. The reckoning she had been holding steel back against arrived in the fifth spring. It came, as the largest turns in her life always did, wearing two faces on the same week. The first was an order. A letter came down from a hotel in Portland, from a chef named Gideon Marsh, who had eaten off one of her paring knives at a friend's table and could not get the feel of it out of his hand. He wanted a full set of 8, cleaver down to the smallest paring blade, and he wanted every one of them cut from the same bar so the steel would match across the whole run, edge to edge and weight to weight, the way a matched team of horses moves as one animal. He asked what she would charge for such a thing. She had never quoted a set before. She looked at the ledger, counted the hours, counted the bars she would never see again once they were gone, and named $60, braced for him to balk. "When can you begin?" was all he wrote back. $60 for 8 knives in a county where a sound workhorse ran 40, and a man counted himself paid well at $1 a day, and where men had stood in the mercantile 5 years gone laughing about the girl who paid to cart home the rust a mill was throwing out. To match all 8 across a single run, she had to know exactly what she held. So she went back to the spark wheel and ground a scrap corner off her reserve bars, one at a time in the dark of the shop, reading the fork and the color of each shower, and she found the one bar clean and high and even enough to carry a whole matched set. It was among the best steel she owned. She cut into it without hesitation, because steel held back forever against a day that never comes is only a slower kind of waste. And this was the day. The second face arrived while the set was still cooling on the rack. Word came up the hollow that the Ammon Falls mill had gone down at last. The timber outfit that bought it after price had run through the good pine, and could not make the notes, and the whole works had passed to a new concern that meant to lay a rail spur across the flat where the mill yard stood and build a depot. and a lumber siding on the level ground. They knocked the mill flat in 3 weeks. A demolition crew, a stack of bricks sold off by the pallet, the great saw sheds pulled down, and the drying kilns broken up for hardcore under the new rail bed. The yard where 900 blades had lain growing moss, where Price had leaned on one hip and laughed until his gold chain shook, became a grated cinder flat with iron rails running across it and a hand-lettered sign promising a depot by the fall. Which meant that Harlan Price, when he came up the hollow that same wet April, had nothing left in the world to sell anybody. The change was written on him, before he said a word, the way a man's circumstances write themselves on his boots before they reach his face. The ox-blood shine was long gone. He had walked up rather than ride, and the mud had ruined the leather past saving, and his checked vest hung looser than it had in the mill office 5 years back. The gold watch chain still crossed it, the one vanity he would carry into the grave, but there was a new carefulness in how he held himself. The wariness of a man who has learned the ground is not as firm under him as he once assumed. He stopped at her gate, the gate she had hung herself on hinges she had forged, and he did not come through it, because some part of him understood at last that the ground on the far side of it was hers and had been earned. Miss Hollis. He got the name right this time. No, honey. No, sweetheart. I'll not waste your morning. The mill's gone, and the concern that owns the ground has no more use for a man who managed a lumber yard than the county does. I've spent 20 years in and around timber salvage. I know where every dead mill from here to the Kennebec has left its iron rotting in the weeds. He paused, and she watched the words cost him something as they came. You've proven there's money in it that nobody else could see. I'm proposing we find the rest of it together. You've the eye and the name. I've the maps and the millmen who owe me favors. A partnership. Say a third to me for the finding. For a moment she almost admired the nerve of it. Here was the man who had laughed until the gold chain shook, who had told her the steel was fit only for the foundry, who had made her pay to cart off his fortune and thrown in the fire brick as a joke at her expense. He had spent 5 years believing she was a fool who got lucky, and now he stood at her gate, proposing to profit from having been wrong, as though being wrong were a service he had rendered her. She let the question hang in the cold April air over the gate latch. She did not gloat, because gloating would have handed him a share of the moment that was hers alone, and she had spent 5 years learning the difference between winning a thing and needing to be seen winning it. Then she gave him the whole of her answer, and it was the same 3 words she gave the timber outfit and the Connecticut agent, and every man who had ever mistaken her work for something he could buy his way into. No, I've work. Price did not argue, which was the only dignified thing she ever saw him do. He looked past her at the shed, at the smoke rising steady from 2 chimneys now, at the neat stacks of skids under the cedar, and something moved across his face that was not quite regret, because regret would have required him to understand what he had lost, and he never did understand it, not fully. He had measured a fortune by the pound and found it wanting. She had measured it by the grain and built a life on it. The two of them would never see the same pile the same way if they both lived 100 years. He turned and walked back down the hollow, and she latched the gate and went into the fire. And that was the last time Harlan Price ever stood on her ground. He was not a monster when she thought of him in the years after, and she thought of him seldom. He was a man with an account book and a policy, and the policy was that a thing which does not obviously make money is worthless, and so is anyone who wants it. He had not been beaten so much as left standing in a grated cinder yard, holding nothing that anyone alive wanted, which is a quieter fate than ruin and a harder one to argue with. She finished the marsh set through the good weather and shipped it down to Portland packed in sawdust and oiled paper, 8 blades cut from one bar, and the letter that came back was 3 lines long, and she pinned it to the wall beside Wren's and her grandfather's photograph. The matched set did in Portland kitchens what the Skinner had done in the sporting papers. Within the year, she was turning away more custom than she took, and the waiting book had stopped being a book a person could reasonably expect to reach the bottom of inside her own lifetime. She made 11 blades a month no more, when she could have made 90 and sold every one before it cooled. She had been offered the money to grow, more than once, by men who could not fathom why a person would refuse it, and she said no every time. Short and plain, a door closing without a slam. That is not the work. She would tell Winnie when the girl asked, and after a while Winnie stopped asking, because she had begun to understand the arithmetic that ran underneath everything Adaline did. The steel was finite. Every bar spent was a bar the world would never see again. To make it fast was to make it common, and to make it common was to spend in a decade a thing that could feed two careful lifetimes and mean something the whole way down. The years went over the hollow the way years do, and the road that had once carried 4 wagons a week and then 15 a morning settled into a steady pilgrim traffic of people who had waited their turn and come to collect a single blade and a receipt with a number on it. The braid down her back took its first threads of silver at the temple, where the loose strands had always gone first, the coffee-colored birthmark below her left ear, unmoved by any of it. Winnie stood at the second bench 4 years, then 5, long enough that Adaline stopped watching her hands, and the two of them worked the shop in the easy silence of people who no longer needed to say what they both already knew. A letter came one spring from a mechanics institute in Portland, the kind of place that kept the tools and machines that had built the state under glass so that the young men learning the trades could see where the work had come from. They had read the periodical pieces. They wanted a Hollis blade for a case on the crafts of the state, and they asked if she would part with it for the first tool she had ever finished. Not her best, her first. The ugly 6-inch drop point with the bad grind at the ricasso and the handle scales she had cut from a weathered fence rail because she had no better wood that week, the one that had hung on a nail over the anvil for years while every finer blade she made went out the gate to a paying hand, took it down and wiped it clean and looked at it a long moment. Winnie, watching, asked whether it hurt to send it away, the first one, the one that had proved she could do the thing at all. It is a piece of steel that got proven right, she said, wrapping it in oiled paper. A thing that has done its work does not need to be kept. It needs to be let go where it can say what it knows. She wrote a card to go in the case with it, in her own blocked hand, and it said only what needed saying, made from mill scrap. Merrow County, Maine. It went into a glass case in Portland with a small brass lamp trained on it, and some young writer for the Institute circular used the word artifact, which made her mouth twitch when Winnie read it to her, because she had cut the handle off a fence post and burned her thumb doing it. That autumn, she took the 11 journals down to a binder in the nearest city large enough to have one, the pages gone soft as cloth at the corners, from her own hands turning them across a decade, and she had every leaf photographed and printed and bound up fresh in 2 hard volumes so the working knowledge in them could not be lost to a house fire or a wet cellar or the plain, slow rot of paper. Cost her more than she had once paid for the entire pile of steel, and she counted it the soundest money she ever spent. She put the originals back in the tin box and set the new copies on Winnie's bench. Read them slow, she said. He was not writing to be understood fast. Then she unclipped the brass-cased pocket caliper from the front of her jacket, the one that had ridden there through every winter since she was 24, the thumb slide worn dark and smooth by her own hand and her grandfather's before her, and she set it in Winnie's palm and closed the girl's fingers over it the way a person hands across a thing that is not going to come back. Waste is only a failure of attention, she said. He told me that with different words. The night I near sold this whole place for $800. Now you know it too, and now it is yours to hand on when your own hands go to keeping instead of making. Winnie could not answer her for a moment. Then she went back to the bench, because that was the only answer that would have meant anything to either of them, and set a file to a blade. The sound of it filled the shop. Adaline walked out under the cedar shakes and stood among the skids in the flat spring light and counted the steel that remained, slow, the way she had counted it on a gray morning in a dead mill yard when she was 6 weeks, an orphan, and the whole county thought her a fool. There was steel enough there to outlast her, and the ledger to prove where every ounce of it had gone, and a girl at the bench behind her who knew what the metal remembered. She had bought a pile of ruin for $30 because she could read a thing that a man with an account book could not, and she had spent the rest of her life proving, one blade and one signed receipt at a time, that the reading was the whole of the wealth. Somewhere not far from you, right now, someone is paying good money to haul away the very thing that would make them rich if only they knew how to look at it. That was the truth her grandfather had gone into the ground believing. And it was the truth she had built a life on top of. And it was the only inheritance she ever meant to leave.